Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back into the long, dim corridors of the past. So, if you're already tucked in, lights down low, maybe a blanket pulled up just right, then we can begin. Take a breath. Let the day soften at the edges. History, at this hour, isn't about battles and thunder. It's about the quiet, strange little details of lives that were once so grand, and yet so fragile. And tonight, our theme is poison. Now, poison in history was never exactly subtle. The stories make it sound like some kind of whispering art, delicate drops slipped into goblets, a slow fade into a tragic end. In reality, it was often clumsy. It was obvious. Sometimes the wrong person drank the wrong cup. And sometimes, people poisoned themselves without even realizing it. Which feels like the most human thing of all. So, let's start where the whispers are loudest, with the Borgias. The Borgia family has become shorthand for poison. If you've ever watched a Renaissance drama, there they are, all velvet sleeves and suspicious goblets. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, had the kind of reputation that makes modern popes look like monks of perfect restraint. He had mistresses, he had children, he had power to consolidate. And, naturally, he had rivals. One of the more enduring stories is that Alexander and his son, Cesare, once prepared a bottle of poison wine for a troublesome cardinal. A perfectly Renaissance solution. But, according to some accounts, they managed to mix up the bottles and drink their own creation. Which is the sort of detail historians can't confirm, but no one wants to let go of. Because it's just too neat. A family famous for poison, undone by their own clumsy catering. Alexander did die suddenly in 1503, swollen and feverish. Cesare lingered on, poisoned but alive, though weakened. It may have been malaria. It may have been food poisoning. Or yes, it may have been their own handiwork. Which feels a bit like labeling your lunch in the office fridge, then stealing it later without realizing. Only with convulsions instead of guilt. But the Borgias weren't unusual. Poison was part of court life. In fact, the people most worried about being poisoned, the wealthy, the royal, the noble, were also the ones most often poisoned. They were, in a way, victims of their own fear. Let's drift a little north. To Tudor England. Henry VIII, that wide and weary king, was famously terrified of poison. He had food tasters. He had rules about who could work in his kitchens. He even had his utensils inspected. Which, in hindsight, was a bit ironic. Because if anything was going to kill him, it wasn't a few drops of venom, it was his own body falling apart. But paranoia runs deep. And so did lead. Which is where his daughter, Elizabeth I, comes in. Elizabeth, known for her intelligence, her sharp tongue, and her elaborate fashions, painted her face with a smooth white foundation. The look was meant to suggest purity, nobility, an almost divine glow. The problem? The foundation was made of lead. Lead that seeped into her skin, day after day. Lead that rotted her teeth, gave her headaches, and probably contributed to her declining health in later years. Courtiers described her smile as majestic. Which was a very polite way of saying falling to pieces. And she wasn't alone. Noble women across Europe coated themselves with the same paint. Some even used belladonna in their eyes. The name itself, beautiful woman. Because a few drops would dilate the pupils and give them a dreamy, mysterious gaze. Of course, belladonna is also deadly nightshade. Which means it caused blurred vision, hallucinations, and, in enough quantity, death. But beauty, apparently, was worth the migraines. So while Henry VIII was busy worrying about poison venison, his daughter was slowly poisoning herself every morning in the mirror. Which says something about the royal tendency to miss the obvious. Now, let's drift eastward. Toward Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire had a reputation for politics that were, let's call them lively. Poison there wasn't just a tool. It was practically a pastime. One recipe mixed hemlock with aconite. Another trick was powdered glass slipped into a cup of wine. That one, by the way, doesn't technically poison you, it just tears your insides to pieces. Subtle in idea, less so in practice. Empress Irene, who ruled as regent in the late 8th century, was rumored to have solved more than one problem with a carefully prepared chalice. She combined prayer with poison, an efficient use of time. And Byzantine politics were already dangerous enough without your dinner being weaponized. If we wander further west again, France offers us a story that feels less like history and more like a soap opera. The affair of the poisons in the 1670s was a sprawling scandal. Aristocrats bought potions and powders from fortune tellers. Husbands died. Wives wasted away. Even mistresses of the king got caught in the rumors. Louis XIV, the Sun King, glittered in gold, ruling from Versailles. But even he found himself glancing nervously at his wine glass. His mistress, Madame de Montespan, was accused of dabbling in black magic and poison. Nothing was proven, but the suspicion lingered. Imagine dining at Versailles, with chandeliers blazing, orchestras playing, and wondering if your soup was trying to kill you. Not exactly relaxing. And then, of course, there's Napoleon. Exiled on St. Helena after all his triumphs and disasters. Conspiracies swirled that the British poisoned him. But modern tests suggest something more mundane. His wallpaper. It was a rich green, dyed with arsenic. In the damp climate, the arsenic released fumes, which meant Napoleon may have slowly breathed himself to death while staring at his bedroom wall. A strange, anticlimactic end. To spend years conquering Europe, only to be finished off by interior design. And finally, let's pause with the Habsburgs. A family already famous for inbreeding. Their genetics didn't need extra help, but life in their palaces offered it anyway. Lead pipes in the plumbing. Mercury in their medicines. Doctors prescribing treatments that did as much harm as the illness. Mercury was common for syphilis, which meant you could die of the cure if the disease didn't get you first. So who were the most poisoned people in history? Not one king, not one empress, but a whole class. The wealthy, the noble, the fashionable. They lived in gilded rooms, drank from silver goblets, powdered their faces, and swallowed their medicines. They were terrified of poisoners in the shadows. And yet, most of the time, they were poisoning themselves, slowly, politely, elegantly. And that, perhaps, is the quiet irony of history. You don't always need a villain. Sometimes people manage the job perfectly well on their own. So, let's settle in a little deeper. If you're still awake, let your shoulders drop. The room is quiet, the world outside is distant. Tonight, history is just background hum. A soft kind of company. Our next theme is inbreeding. Royal families, for centuries, treated marriage less like romance and more like rearranging a very small deck of cards. The result was a handful of dynasties who were impressively wealthy, impressively powerful, and, genetically speaking, impressively fragile. And, of course, we have to start with the Habsburgs. The Habsburg dynasty was practically a living experiment in how much you could fold a family tree back onto itself before it stopped resembling a tree at all. Their solution to almost every political problem was marriage. Got a rival kingdom? Marry it. Need to keep a crown in the family? Marry a cousin. Short on cousins? Don't worry. There are plenty of nieces. By the 16th and 17th centuries, this policy had produced some of the most famous jawlines in history. The so-called Habsburg jaw. Portraits show it clearly: long faces, thick lower lips, chins jutting out as if trying to escape. Charles II of Spain became the poster child of this dynasty. Charles was born in 1661, the son of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. Which sounds simple enough, until you realize Philip was Mariana's uncle. Which meant Charles's family tree was less a branching structure and more of a tightly wound knot. The result? A boy who was technically king, but who could barely chew food. His jaw was so misaligned he struggled to speak clearly. He was sickly all his life. He didn't walk until he was 8. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4. His education was minimal because no one believed he'd survive long enough to need it. But he did survive. For nearly 39 years. And he outlived all his siblings, which was awkward, because that meant he had to rule. Spanish ambassadors described him as imbecile. Courtiers whispered that he was bewitched. He was married twice, once to a French princess and once to a German one, in the desperate hope he'd produce an heir. He never did. In fact, he could barely perform the basic duties expected of a king, marital or otherwise. When Charles died in 1700, childless, the Spanish Habsburg line died with him. Generations of folding the family tree back onto itself had ended with a man who couldn't pass it on. Which feels like a dark little moral tale, though in reality, it just meant a very large European war broke out over who got to inherit his empty throne. Now, let's drift north again. To England. The Tudors weren't nearly as inbred as the Habsburgs, but they weren't immune. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon, who was herself a product of Spanish cousin marriages. Their only surviving child was Mary I. Poor Mary inherited her mother's piety and her father's temper. She tried to restore Catholicism to England with a campaign of burnings that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. It didn't help her reputation that she married her cousin, Philip II of Spain, another Habsburg with that unmistakable jaw. Their union produced no children. Mary suffered phantom pregnancies, swelling in hope, then collapsing in disappointment. A body longing for heirs it would never deliver. Elizabeth I, Mary's half-sister, famously never married at all. Which, considering her options, may have been a subtle stroke of genius. Over in France, things weren't much better. Louis XIV, the Sun King, married his double first cousin. Double, as in, they shared both sets of grandparents. It kept the Bourbon bloodline neat, if not particularly diverse. His descendants spread across Europe, into Spain, into Naples, into Parma. A shining dynasty built on a very shallow gene pool. And then there's Austria again. Marie Antoinette, the tragic Queen of France, came from the Habsburgs too. Her parents were Maria Theresa and Francis I, who were technically third cousins. By that point the bloodlines had thinned a little, but the damage was already baked in. Marie herself was healthy enough, but her relatives were not always so lucky. Hemophilia, epilepsy, and other inherited conditions crept through the royal families of Europe like shadows at a feast. If you drift eastward again, to Russia, the Romanovs married into the same networks. Tsar Nicholas II married Alexandra of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Which brings us to another famous genetic problem, hemophilia. Victoria herself was a carrier of the disease. She passed it along like an unwelcome heirloom. Her grandsons bled uncontrollably from the smallest cuts. Her great-grandson, Alexei Romanov, the heir to the Russian throne, inherited it too. His illness became a state secret. The boy couldn't run or play without risking death. His desperate mother turned to the mystic Rasputin for help, believing his prayers could ease the bleeding. Whether they did or not is less important than the fact that the imperial family thought they did. Which was, in its own way, fatal. But let's return, softly, to Spain one more time. Because Charles II wasn't the only Habsburg with problems. He was simply the most famous. The dynasty had been collecting defects for generations. Epilepsy in one branch. Infertility in another. A king of Portugal who had seizures, a queen who died young after too many pregnancies. All carefully preserved in gilt frames and velvet thrones. It makes you wonder what those royal banquets felt like. A long table, glittering with silver and candles, filled with people who all looked slightly the same. Cousins marrying cousins, faces blending until the portraits blur. Power hoarded so tightly it strangled itself. And yet, despite it all, they clung to the system. Because in their world, marrying outside the family felt more dangerous than marrying inside it. Foreign blood was suspect. Outsiders were rivals. Better a sickly cousin than a healthy enemy. So, the most inbred monarchs in history? The answer is many. The Habsburgs are the headline act, of course, but they had plenty of company. Bourbons, Tudors, Romanovs, even the modest little branches of German dukes and duchesses. They all chose the same strategy. And they all paid the same quiet price. A reminder, perhaps, that dynasties don't fall only to swords or revolutions. Sometimes, they simply fold inward until they collapse under their own weight. Hey everyone! Tonight, We're leaving behind the poisoned banquets and the arsenic wallpaper, and we're stepping softly into something smaller. Something more delicate. The childhoods of medieval royals. Now, childhood is supposed to be a time of innocence. Running in meadows, catching frogs, and perhaps inventing imaginary friends with better personalities than your cousins. But if you happen to be born into royalty in the Middle Ages, chances are your childhood was less about play and more about politics, tutors, and the looming question of whether you would live past age 5. Because royal children were both spoiled beyond belief and, at the same time, astonishingly neglected. They could be wrapped in silk, handed golden rattles, and yet still die from drinking contaminated water because no one understood germs. It was luxury layered over fragility, like a velvet blanket thrown across a crumbling chair. Let's start with the basics: medieval infant survival rates. Even for the wealthy, the odds weren't great. Diseases didn't really care if your father wore a crown. Smallpox, measles, dysentery, these all had a way of arriving uninvited to the royal nursery. Some dynasties barely managed to keep a single heir alive. The Tudors, for example, were practically cursed when it came to producing healthy male children. Henry VIII lost child after child with his 6 wives. Out of all those pregnancies, only 3 legitimate children survived into adulthood. And even then, adulthood in Tudor England was a loose concept. It could mean being 16 and looking twice your age thanks to smallpox scars. But beyond the constant shadow of illness, there were the strange ways royals were raised. Babies were often immediately handed off to wet nurses and governesses. Queens rarely raised their own children. That was considered far too messy, and possibly undignified. So, a future king might bond more with a hired caretaker than with his actual mother. It's no wonder so many of them grew up slightly detached, slightly awkward, and occasionally inclined to execute people at breakfast. Some royal childhoods were particularly bleak. Take poor Edward V of England. He was one of the infamous princes in the Tower. He became king at the age of 12, was promptly locked up in the Tower of London by his uncle Richard, and never seen again. It's not exactly the kind of childhood you'd find in a bedtime story. Unless, of course, the bedtime story was being read by Machiavelli. But even when they weren't disappearing mysteriously, royal children's lives could still be suffocatingly controlled. Their every move was dictated by etiquette. How to bow, how to speak, when to eat, what to wear. Even playtime was scheduled. And their toys? Usually miniature versions of adult objects. Tiny suits of armor, small thrones, little crowns. Imagine being 5 years old and having your play involve practicing how to look regal while sitting very still. That's less play and more unpaid internship. And then, of course, there was marriage. Or rather, the betrothal process. Royal children were rarely treated as actual children. From the moment they were born, they were bargaining chips. A son could be promised in marriage to a foreign princess before he could even walk. A daughter could be shipped off at 12 or 13 to marry a man twice, sometimes 3 times her age. Childhood was less about growing up, and more about waiting around until it was time to seal a political alliance with your signature in your body. Take Isabella of Valois, married to Richard II of England when she was just 6 years old. 6. She was too young to even understand what marriage meant. The two never lived as husband and wife in the traditional sense, thank goodness, but she was still called Queen of England before she had lost her baby teeth. And when Richard was eventually deposed, Isabella was left a child widow, political pawn, and eventual bargaining tool for yet another dynastic match. Of course, not all childhood tragedies were political. Some were just the result of being raised in gilded cages. Many royal children suffered from rickets due to lack of sunlight, since they were kept indoors for safety. Some were overfed on rich foods far too early, leading to chronic digestive problems. Others were simply lonely. Imagine being told you couldn't play with common children because they were beneath you, while also being too important to mingle freely with other nobles. Many royal nurseries were quiet, sterile places. A few nurses, some tutors, and a child who was already treated as more symbol than person. And then there's Charles II of Spain, sometimes called El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. His childhood was a long catalogue of misfortune. Born from centuries of Habsburg inbreeding, Charles was physically and mentally frail. He didn't speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8, and his education was so neglected that he remained almost illiterate. While other royal children were at least forced to endure endless lessons, Charles was coddled to the point of ignorance. His family feared that too much learning would strain his fragile health. So instead of a childhood filled with tutors, he had one filled with overprotection and superstition. And all of this while being paraded around as the heir to one of Europe's greatest empires. It's difficult to imagine a sadder childhood than being a living symbol of dynastic decay before you even reach puberty. Sometimes the sadness of royal childhoods came not from illness or politics, but simply from neglect. Parents saw their children less as people and more as dynastic assets. Affection was often in short supply. Louis XIV of France, for example, was raised with such formality that his mother could barely show him any warmth. Every moment of his young life was staged, rehearsed, and witnessed by dozens of courtiers. Even when he woke up in the morning, he was surrounded by attendants observing the royal child as though he were a museum exhibit. Imagine growing up with an audience every time he yawned. Still, some royal children were spoiled in more conventional ways. They had jewels as toys, feasts when they should have had porridge, and wardrobes larger than most towns. But luxury doesn't necessarily equate to happiness. Overindulgence often bred fragile health and fragile personalities. A child who was never told no often grew into an adult who couldn't quite handle reality. Which might explain why so many kings and queens had meltdowns the moment something didn't go their way. So, when we think of royal childhoods, we might picture privilege. But in reality, they were often lonely, sickly, and oddly sad affairs. A blend of silk sheets and damp stone walls. Of tutors with sticks, and dolls that doubled as symbols of dynastic power. And in the end, many of those children never made it to adulthood anyway. They were the sickly buds on the royal family tree, pampered, protected, and yet still doomed to wither far too early. Let's drift now, slowly, to another question. If royal children grew up in such strange, suffocating ways, what happened when they finally reached adulthood and had to rule? Spoiler, it didn't always go well. But that's for later. For now, let's leave them tucked in their velvet cradles, pale from lack of sunlight, and move softly onward to the next tale. So, we've drifted past the royal nurseries and the pale little heirs in their velvet cradles. Now let's wander into adulthood. Because if you were raised in isolation, spoiled beyond sense, and handed a crown before you'd really grown up, the odds of becoming a well-adjusted monarch were slim. Royal adulthood, much like royal childhood, was rarely about competence. It was about power, appearances, and, more often than not, pettiness. If you've ever seen a family squabble escalate at a holiday dinner, now imagine that argument with armies, treasuries, and entire nations involved. That was basically medieval politics. Let's begin with Charles VI of France. Nicknamed Charles the Beloved early in life, he later became known as Charles the Mad. And for good reason. At the age of 24, Charles had a psychotic break and attacked his own knights in a forest, killing several of them. After that, he was prone to hallucinations, fits, and the occasional belief that he was made of glass. He wore iron rods in his clothes to keep from shattering, and he refused to let people touch him in case he broke into pieces. A glass king for a glass kingdom. France, meanwhile, descended into chaos as his relatives and nobles fought for control. Then there was King John of England, sometimes called John Lackland. John was so petty that he once starved a nobleman's wife and son to death in a dungeon, just to prove a point. He also had a habit of losing wars, raising taxes, and generally making himself so unpopular that his barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. A document which, of course, he immediately tried to ignore. John may have been one of history's best examples of a monarch who took petty grievances and inflated them until they destabilized an entire kingdom. Royal pettiness wasn't always violent, though. Sometimes it was just absurd. Take Frederick William I of Prussia, known as the Soldier King. He adored tall soldiers. Obsessed over them, really. He created a regiment of exceptionally tall men, sometimes called the Potsdam Giants. And he didn't just recruit them. He bought them, traded for them, even kidnapped tall men from other countries. His poor wife reportedly had to travel incognito to avoid foreign rulers hiding their tallest servants. All because Frederick wanted his army to look impressive on parade. Practical? Not at all. Petty? Extremely. But perhaps no one matched the dysfunction of Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan had been neglected and abused as a child, left to wander the Kremlin half-starved, and he grew into an adult with a deep love of both prayer and torture. He once had an entire city massacred because he suspected it of disloyalty. And in a fit of rage, he struck his own son so violently that he killed him. The result was a dynasty crippled by paranoia, grief, and the lingering sense that Russia had been ruled by a man who treated his subjects like chess pieces, pieces he could smash whenever he felt like it. Of course, royal pettiness often found its way into marriages too. Henry VIII of England is the prime example. He cycled through 6 wives, executing 2, divorcing 2, and leaving the others to die young. Each decision seemed to come from a mix of insecurity, lust, and the inability to admit he might be the problem. And yet, somehow, he styled himself as divinely chosen. Which is ironic, considering half of Europe saw him as little more than a spoiled man throwing very bloody tantrums. Sometimes dysfunction came in quieter forms. Queen Christina of Sweden abdicated her throne in 1654, declaring she didn't want to marry or produce heirs. Instead, she moved to Rome, collected philosophers and artists, and occasionally startled the Pope by behaving in ways deemed scandalous for a former queen. While less bloody than Ivan or Henry, Christina's reign was still marked by erratic decision-making and the kind of personal whims that left an entire country politically adrift. And then there was Philip II of Spain, who ruled over one of the largest empires in history but micromanaged it to the point of dysfunction. He read every document, approved every order, and often delayed decisions for months because he couldn't bear to let go of control. Picture a monarch treating an empire like an inbox he refused to delegate. It wasn't so much governance as obsessive hoarding of paperwork. The pattern is clear enough: spoiled children, neglected heirs, and dynastic experiments in cousin marriage often grew into adults who were erratic at best and disastrous at worst. Their kingdoms suffered not from grand strategic failures, but from everyday pettiness. From grudges, insecurities, and personal quirks inflated into matters of state. And yet, perhaps that's what makes them so oddly human. Strip away the crowns and titles, and what you find are people just as small-minded as anyone else, only with the power to turn their tantrums into wars, their obsessions into national policy, and their paranoia into prisons. So let's drift away from the dysfunctional monarchs for now, leaving them to their glass delusions, their tall soldiers, and their unfortunate wives. Next, we'll wander into a gentler but equally strange corner of history. Because if royals could be dysfunctional in their ruling, they could also be very peculiar in their dying. And the question becomes, what were the strangest royal deaths? But that's for the next part of our night. Death, of course, comes for everyone. Kings, queens, emperors, it makes no difference. But royals had a way of making their ends memorable, and not always in the noble, sword-raising, battle-cry sort of fashion. More often than not, their deaths were absurd, ironic, or deeply inconvenient. Let's begin with Charles VIII of France. His reign wasn't especially remarkable, but his death was unforgettable, in the worst way. In 1498, Charles was walking through his castle when he hit his head on the top of a doorway. A simple bump, the kind of thing most people brush off. But Charles wasn't most people. He collapsed, lingered for a few hours, and died. All because medieval French architecture and royal skulls didn't get along. Imagine ruling one of Europe's great kingdoms, only to be undone by a poorly measured lintel. Then there's King Edmund Ironside of England. His death is a matter of some dispute, but one account suggests he was assassinated while using the privy. According to the tale, an assassin hid beneath the toilet seat with a sharp weapon and struck from below. Whether it's true or not, the story stuck. Because apparently nothing says royal dignity like being murdered on the loo. Moving east, we find Byzantine Emperor Julian, sometimes called the Apostate. He rejected Christianity in favor of reviving pagan traditions. His reign was short, his reforms unpopular, and his death, well, it came courtesy of a spear thrown during battle. But the details are muddled. Some said it was an enemy soldier. Others whispered that it was one of his own men, tired of his policies. Either way, Julian supposedly plucked the spear from his wound, muttered something about losing to Galilean carpenters, and died. A man so bitter that his last words were basically a complaint. Of course, some royals died from their own hobbies. Take King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. His death in 1771 reads less like a tragedy and more like the cautionary tale of a dinner gone wrong. He ate a meal of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, champagne, and 14 servings of his favorite dessert, semla, a rich bun filled with cream and almond paste. Unsurprisingly, his body gave up shortly after. Sweden still remembers him as the king who ate himself to death. Then there was Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, one of the most powerful rulers of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1190, while leading the Third Crusade, he tried to cross a river on horseback. The horse slipped, Frederick was thrown into the water, and the emperor drowned. A grand imperial crusade cut short by one clumsy moment in a river. His soldiers, demoralized, scattered. It was the medieval version of a campaign lost to a misplaced step. And let's not forget King Alexander of Greece, whose reign was brief and whose death was stranger still. In 1920, while walking in his gardens, he tried to separate his dog from a monkey that had wandered in. The monkey bit him. The wound became infected. Medicine failed. And the king was dead within weeks. An empire shaken by a monkey bite. Some deaths carried a heavy dose of irony. Attila the Hun, for instance. Known as the Scourge of God, he terrorized much of Europe. You might expect him to die in battle, pierced by a dozen swords. Instead, he died on his wedding night, suffocating after a nosebleed flooded his throat while he slept. The man who burned cities to the ground was undone by his own sinuses. Or consider King George II of Great Britain. In 1760, he died suddenly while using the toilet, apparently from an aortic aneurysm. At least this time no assassin was lurking beneath the seat. Just his own body deciding it had had enough. Even the mighty emperors of China were not spared odd ends. The Jiaqing Emperor of the Ming Dynasty, for example, was obsessed with immortality. He consumed alchemical elixirs designed to prolong life, full of toxic mercury. Naturally, he poisoned himself slowly until his organs failed. So much for eternal life. What's striking in all of this is how rarely royals died the grand, cinematic deaths we imagine. More often, they slipped on stairs, ate too much pudding, got bitten by monkeys, or poisoned themselves with the very potions meant to preserve them. Thrones, armies, palaces, they protected against assassination, but not against accidents, bad diets, or questionable life choices. So perhaps that's the lesson. No matter how gilded your crown, how velvet-lined your bedchamber, or how divine your titles claim you to be, you're still human enough to trip on a step, swallow the wrong tincture, or lose a fight to dessert. And with that thought, let's leave our royals to their undignified ends. Next, we'll drift to something a little softer again, not death, but daily life. What, exactly, did the medieval court look like on an ordinary day? Not the coronations or the battles, but the quieter, sillier rhythms of palace living. But that's where we'll head in our next stretch of the night. Royal life is often imagined as a parade of grand ceremonies, glittering banquets, and solemn declarations. But most of the time, it wasn't like that at all. Life in a medieval court was as much about waiting, gossiping, and trying not to freeze in your drafty stone castle as it was about any great affairs of state. Let's picture it together. The sun rises, late, of course, because no one in the royal household was especially eager to leap out of bed at dawn. The king or queen, if they weren't still lingering in bed, would begin the day with something that resembled a ritual. Dressing wasn't just dressing. It was an event. Robes were laid out by attendants, shoes handed over reverently, crowns adjusted just so. Imagine needing 3 people just to put on your stockings in the morning. For the royals, even underwear could be a public performance. Breakfast, if it happened at all, was usually light. Medieval elites weren't known for eating much in the morning. A little bread, some watered wine, maybe fruit if the kitchens were in a generous mood. Of course, the real meals would come later, and when they came, they arrived in style. The Great Hall was the center of things. long wooden tables, often sticky from years of spilled ale, stretched beneath rafters hung with tapestries. At the far end, the monarch and close family sat on a dais, slightly raised, because even while chewing roast goose, hierarchy mattered. Meals could drag on for hours, with course after course carried in by servants. There might be roasted boar, venison pies, fish prepared in far too many creative ways, and desserts thick with honey and spices. And naturally, enough alcohol to drown the memory of yesterday's politics. But eating wasn't just eating. It was a performance of wealth. Spices were sprinkled not just for flavor but as proof of status. Cinnamon and saffron were more than ingredients, they were social climbing in powder form. Guests, meanwhile, had to follow strict etiquette. Don't reach across the table. Don't take food with both hands. Don't forget to dab delicately with your napkin rather than smearing grease on your sleeves. And above all, don't eat before the monarch does. Unless, of course, you wanted to make a career-ending statement with your spoon. Between meals, much of court life was, well, gossip. Courtiers spent their days scheming in corners, whispering in corridors, trying to win favor or avoid disgrace. Royal palaces were less like shining centers of justice and more like very fancy high schools. Who was in favor this week? Who had been caught making an unfortunate remark about the Queen's new headdress? Who was seen with whose cousin after the feast? For the ambitious, every smile was strategy, every word a move in a game no one could ever stop playing. Entertainment was another pillar. Minstrels strummed lutes. Poets recited verses that were usually either too long or too boring. Sometimes jugglers and acrobats were brought in, which livened things up until someone dropped a torch. Chess was a favorite, though few monarchs were especially good at it. And of course, hunting occupied an enormous amount of time. Stalking deer through the forest was less about food, the kitchens had plenty, and more about proving that, yes, the king could still aim an arrow without looking completely foolish. There was also the matter of hygiene, or the lack thereof. Despite what romantic paintings suggest, most castles smelled less like roses and more like a mixture of smoke, sweat, and damp rushes on the floor. Chamber pots were emptied only when necessary, and windows were drafty at best. Perfumed oils and herbs were used to cover odors, which worked only up to a point. You might imagine a medieval banquet hall as full of laughter and song. In reality, it was also full of flies. Children of the court were raised in this world of half ceremony, half chaos. Princes were dressed like miniature adults by the age of 5, while princesses were instructed in how to sit, smile, and not spill soup on their gowns. Tutors lectured them on Latin and scripture, though much of their true education came from simply watching the endless parade of human folly around them. And then there was idleness, the one thing that defined royal courts more than anything else. Hours could pass with nothing happening at all. A king might wander from chamber to chamber, trailing attendants, occasionally muttering about taxes or wars, but mostly just killing time until supper. Queens might embroider, pray, or chat with ladies-in-waiting about who was secretly ill or secretly pregnant. Waiting was the essence of court life, waiting for news, waiting for favor, waiting for the monarch to decide something, anything. Of course, beneath the dull rhythms, danger was always present. One wrong look, one careless remark, one bit of gossip repeated in the wrong ear, and your career, or your head, could end. Courtiers lived in constant tension, smiling politely while their stomachs churned. And yet, people sought out court life obsessively. Because despite the discomfort, the rivalries, and the smell, the court was the stage of power. To be seen there, even just standing quietly in the corner, meant you mattered. And for many, that mattered more than comfort, or honesty, or even survival. So that was daily life in the medieval court, equal parts ceremony, boredom, scheming, and the occasional roast swan. Not exactly the glittering fairy tale palace we picture. More like a strange, expensive waiting room, where the most powerful people in the land spent their days trying not to embarrass themselves before dessert. And with that image lingering, let's drift onward. Because beyond the walls of the court lay something even stranger, the royal rituals. The coronations, the anointings, the bizarre ceremonies where power was made real by oil, robes, or the touch of a sword. That's where we'll wander next. If you've ever thought royal ceremonies looked a little over the top, you're right. They were. But that was the point. In a world where most people lived in huts and worked the land from dawn to dusk, nothing said "I'm chosen by God" quite like a glittering, hours-long spectacle involving crowns, relics, and enough incense to choke a small village. Let's start with the coronation. A coronation wasn't simply putting a crown on someone's head. Oh no! It was theater. It was liturgy. It was a carefully choreographed performance where everyone, from the archbishop to the stable boys, was reminded of their place. The king or queen, often looking slightly bewildered beneath layers of ermine and jewels, would process slowly through the church. Latin chants echoed from the choir. Nobles stood in stiff rows, silently calculating how long until their feet went numb. At the heart of it was the anointing. Oil was dabbed on the monarch's head, chest, and sometimes hands. Ordinary olive oil? Hardly. This was holy oil, sometimes with recipes shrouded in mystery. One batch supposedly included balm from the Holy Land, another claimed to have been delivered by a dove from heaven, which, to be clear, it hadn't been. But everyone politely agreed it was divine, because that's what you did. The crown itself was not just a hat. It was a holy object. Some crowns contained relics, bits of bone, fragments of the true cross, or at least what someone claimed was a fragment of the true cross. To wear it was to physically embody kingship. To drop it, or worse, to lose it, was the medieval equivalent of announcing you were cursed. Naturally, this led to some rather tense moments when crowns were too heavy to balance properly. Some monarchs had to prop their heads awkwardly for hours while trying not to faint under the weight. Of course, after the solemnity came the feasting. Coronation banquets were legendary. Imagine hundreds of dishes, from peacocks roasted and redressed in their own feathers, to pies stuffed with live birds that would burst out when cut open, providing what can only be described as medieval dinner theater. The wine flowed freely, and the symbolism was everywhere. Each course was an allegory. Each toast a reminder that the king or queen wasn't just any human being, they were divinely appointed. Or at least, that's what the propaganda said. Other rituals filled royal calendars. Knighthood ceremonies, for instance, involved oaths, vigils, and the dramatic tapping of a sword on the shoulder. It sounds dignified, but in practice, it was sometimes awkward. Imagine kneeling too long on a stone floor, trying to look noble while your legs went numb, only to be lightly bonked on the head by a monarch who may or may not remember your name. Then there were weddings. Royal weddings weren't about romance. They were treaties disguised as nuptials. Two nervous teenagers, or in some cases, children, would be dressed in absurdly fine clothes, paraded in front of crowds, and solemnly bound together in matrimony. Afterward, the bedding ceremony took place. Yes, they really did make it public. The couple was escorted to bed by courtiers, prayers were recited, and the curtains were drawn while everyone pretended not to be watching. It was less about love and more about making absolutely sure heirs would happen. Subtlety was not a medieval strong point. Funerals, too, carried their own oddities. Monarchs were embalmed, dressed in state robes, and displayed for days, sometimes weeks. Effigies were made to ride in processions, because the real body wasn't always in great shape for travel. And just like in life, death was used as a political stage. Nobles jockeyed for position even while incense drifted around the coffin. The message was always clear: even in death, royalty was set apart. And then there were the stranger ceremonies. Touching for the king's evil, for instance. Some monarchs, especially in England and France, claimed the divine ability to cure scrofula, a form of tuberculosis, simply by laying hands on the sufferer. Entire crowds lined up for this supposed miracle. Did it work? Of course not. But people swore it did, because the alternative, admitting the king was just another mortal, was unthinkable. Each of these rituals, from coronations to funerals, functioned as more than pomp. They were glue. They held together societies that otherwise might have pulled apart. They reminded everyone that their monarch wasn't just wealthy or powerful, but something other. Something ordained. And as long as people believed it, the crown endured. But behind the glitter and incense, there was always a human. Sweating under heavy robes. Bored during endless liturgies. Anxious about stumbling on the steps. Royal rituals made them seem larger than life, but privately, they were just as uncomfortable and awkward as the rest of us would be. Perhaps even more so. And with that, let's drift onward again. From the formal pageantry of ceremonies, we'll move into something more personal. Because while crowns and oil were one thing, nothing shaped medieval royals more deeply than their health, or lack thereof. Next, we'll meander into the fragile, often failing bodies that sat on thrones. If you were a medieval monarch, chances are your body was not quite as sturdy as the glowing portraits suggested. Paintings showed smooth skin, proud posture, and shining hair. Reality was more frail. Let's start with diet. Royals had access to endless banquets, which sounds delightful until you remember what those banquets contained. Meat, more meat, and occasionally a side of meat. Venison, boar, swan, even peacock, if it moved, it was roasted. Vegetables, considered peasant food, were pushed aside. Fruit was eaten sparingly, usually candied into sticky, tooth-cracking lumps. And water, of course, was for commoners. Royals drank wine and ale instead. Not in moderation, either. So, unsurprisingly, gout became known as the disease of kings. Toes swelled, joints stiffened, and monarchs hobbled through their palaces, clutching at canes. Henry VIII is perhaps the poster child for this. By the end of his life, his legs were so swollen and ulcerated that courtiers had to wheel him about in a sort of early wheelchair. He ate like a feast was a daily rite, and his body simply gave up in protest. Imagine a man so paranoid about being poisoned that he banned half the cooks from his kitchens, yet so careless about gluttony that he was effectively poisoning himself every day with roasted capons and pies. Then there was the matter of hygiene. Bathing was irregular at best. Some kings believed water weakened the body. Others simply disliked the fuss of it. Instead, perfumes, powders, and fine linens were meant to do the work of soap. Not very effectively. Illness spread easily in crowded courts. A single coughing servant could lay low half a palace in days. And once disease entered, medicine was, shall we say, experimental. Doctors prescribed bloodletting for nearly everything. Headache? Bloodletting. Fever? Bloodletting. Weak constitution? You guessed it. Sometimes leeches were applied, sometimes veins opened. Patients often emerged weaker than before, but physicians assured them it was necessary to balance their humors. Royal women, meanwhile, endured their own particular health burdens. Childbirth was dangerous. Even queens surrounded by midwives, physicians, and prayers faced staggering risks. Many died young, or endured multiple miscarriages. The pressure to produce heirs only made it worse. Every pregnancy was both a personal trial and a political gamble. Let's not forget lead and mercury, two substances royals consumed with astonishing regularity. Lead turned up in cosmetics and drinking vessels. Mercury appeared in medical treatments, especially for syphilis. The cure was often deadlier than the disease. Court physicians cheerfully applied mercury ointments, convinced it would draw out illness. Instead, it poisoned the body slowly, rotting teeth, damaging nerves, and clouding minds. And then there were the inherited conditions. Generations of cousin marriages left many dynasties with fragile constitutions. The Habsburg jaw is perhaps the most famous example, so pronounced in later generations that speaking and chewing became difficult. But it wasn't just jaws. Weak lungs, epilepsy, and infertility plagued royal families, quietly shaping the course of history. Sometimes wars were fought simply because a king could not produce a healthy heir. Despite all this, monarchs were often presented as near immortal in life. Chronicles described them as strong, divinely protected. Yet privately, they coughed, limped, and bled like anyone else. Perhaps more so. Palaces were gilded cages filled with luxuries that weakened rather than strengthened. Cushions and jewels could not ward off infected wounds or hereditary decline. It's a strange irony. The people most protected from hunger, exposure, and labor were often undone by abundance itself. Too much meat. Too much wine. Too much cousin marriage. Too much trust in a physician with a bag full of leeches. And yet, these fragile bodies still carried crowns. They still signed decrees, led armies, sometimes from litters carried by servants, and inspired loyalty. A king might be bloated, limping, and half poisoned, but as long as the crown sat firmly on his head, the illusion of strength remained. So the story of royal health is not one of vigor and fitness. It's a story of survival, often barely achieved. Of kings hobbling to councils, queens enduring pregnancy after pregnancy, and children born already sickly. Behind every glittering coronation and grand procession, there was usually a monarch quietly nursing a wound, an ulcer, or a hereditary defect. Let's drift onward from their fragile bodies now, and into the fragile world they ruled. Because if medieval royals were weak in health, they were often equally weak in their tempers. And nothing shows us their humanity quite like the tantrums and pettiness that sometimes shook entire kingdoms. One of the quiet delights of studying monarchs is realizing how astonishingly petty they could be. Kings and queens, armed with crowns, armies, and treasuries, often used their power not to reshape the world but to settle grudges that would embarrass a schoolyard. Take Richard II of England. He was crowned as a child and grew into a man convinced of his divine brilliance. Unfortunately, his nobles did not agree. Richard spent much of his reign stewing over perceived slights, punishing anyone who dared question him. He once had a noble executed for failing to remove his boots in the king's presence. It was not exactly a path to popularity. His eventual downfall was less about grand politics and more about the fact that his temper had exhausted everyone around him. Or consider Charles VI of France. Known later as Charles the Mad, he sometimes believed he was made of glass. He also had a habit of violently lashing out at courtiers, friends, and once even his own brother. Yet it wasn't always madness, sometimes it was simply spite. At one feast, he refused to look at a cousin he disliked, staring firmly in the opposite direction for hours, like a sulking child. Entire councils had to tiptoe around his moods. Then there was the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Brilliant, multilingual, lover of falcons and philosophy, but also notoriously thin-skinned. If a pope annoyed him, Frederick would retaliate not by negotiation but by publishing long, sulky letters accusing the pope of incompetence. He treated diplomacy like a personal insult contest, and Europe watched, half amused, half exasperated. Royal tantrums weren't confined to men. Queens, too, had their moments. Isabella of Castile, otherwise remembered as a shrewd ruler, once refused to speak to her husband Ferdinand for weeks because he had dared to conduct some business without her. And of Austria reportedly threw objects at courtiers when in a mood. And Catherine de' Medici, formidable as she was, could sulk with terrifying silence, a talent that unsettled even her adult children. But the pettiness could escalate. Monarchs had the means to turn sulks into state crises. A quarrel over protocol might lead to years of diplomatic frost between kingdoms. One royal refusing to marry another could spark a war. Something as trivial as who sat closest at a banquet table might determine whether nations remained allies or enemies. Henry VIII again provides a perfect example. His obsession with divorcing Catherine of Aragon was, at its heart, less about theology than about his frustration at not getting his way. The result was the English Reformation. An entire country's religious future shifted because one man threw what was essentially a tantrum over succession. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, draped in gold and adored, was also prone to sulking. If someone failed to bow low enough, or a noblewoman appeared in the wrong gown, Louis would respond with a carefully staged cold shoulder. Courtiers dreaded his disapproval, not because it was violent, but because it could end careers. Louis used pettiness as an art form, weaving it into court life until everyone lived in fear of his frown. In many ways, this is the most human side of royalty. We can't always relate to wars or treaties. But sulking at dinner? Holding grudges? Refusing to speak to someone for weeks? That feels familiar. The difference is that when a modern person sulks, the worst outcome might be an awkward family holiday. When a monarch sulked, nations sometimes collapsed into chaos. The petty dramas of royal households ripple through history more than we realize. Behind treaties and wars often lay bruised egos. Behind reforms and decrees, there were kings and queens trying to one-up rivals or prove themselves right in an argument. And yet, despite the tantrums, they still ruled. Crowns were polished, ceremonies held, portraits painted. The illusion of majesty was carefully maintained, even as monarchs pouted, raged, or refused to eat dinner with someone they disliked. It's oddly comforting. History tends to paint kings and queens as distant figures, symbols of grandeur. But the truth is, many were no more emotionally mature than a sulky teenager. They just happened to have entire kingdoms as their stage. Let's drift gently onward now. We've seen their fragile health, and their fragile tempers. Perhaps it's time to look at something more enduring, the ways monarchs tried to immortalize themselves. The tombs, palaces, and monuments they demanded. Because nothing reveals vanity quite like a royal grave. If there's one thing monarchs hated more than rebellious nobles, it was being forgotten. And so, they built. And built. And built some more. Tombs, palaces, and monuments became less about practical use and more about leaving a mark on the world. It was the royal version of scribbling one's name in wet cement, just with slightly more marble and unpaid labor. Take the pharaohs of Egypt. Their pyramids were meant to be eternal. Solid, immovable, celestial staircases carrying kings into eternity. The irony, of course, is that nearly every pyramid was promptly looted. Gold stolen, mummies tossed aside, treasures melted down. The supposed eternal resting place became little more than a stone shell full of sand and echoes. But the silhouettes still rise above the desert, reminding us of kings whose names most of us barely remember. The monuments outlasted the memory. In medieval Europe, monarchs weren't much better. Richard the Lionheart, famed crusader, spent so little time in England that his subjects probably wouldn't have recognized him. But his tomb at Fontevraud Abbey makes up for it, stone effigy, hands folded, face serene. In death, he was finally present in his own kingdom, even if in polished limestone rather than flesh. Then there's Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He decided his final resting place needed to reflect both piety and power. He commissioned the grand monastery palace of El Escorial in Spain. A place so vast it was nicknamed the Eighth Wonder of the World. The complex was a mix of church, palace, monastery, and mausoleum. Because why settle for one function when you can demand all four? Naturally, Charles never lived to see it finished. Vanity projects have a way of outliving their creators. Louis XIV, never one for modesty, poured his vanity into Versailles. Endless corridors, mirrored halls, fountains spraying like liquid jewels. It wasn't just a palace, it was an ego on display. Every inch whispered, or rather shouted, about his glory. Of course, the upkeep nearly bankrupted France, but what is a little financial ruin compared to a nice garden view? In England, Henry VII left behind Westminster Abbey's Lady Chapel. A soaring, lace-like structure of stone that seems almost impossible. His tomb rests inside, a monument to a man who spent his life clawing for legitimacy and wanted to make sure no one forgot him. His son, Henry VIII, had grand plans for a vast, dazzling tomb. Marble, bronze, gilt, fit for a king of unmatched glory. Naturally, it was never finished. Henry, in death as in life, left behind a mess. Royal vanity wasn't just about buildings. It crept into funerals too. Elizabeth I's funeral was a spectacle of plumes, banners, and solemn grandeur. Louis XIV's funeral cortege stretched endlessly, though mourners reportedly muttered with relief that the king who had outlived them all was finally gone. Catherine the Great had herself laid out in a gilded coffin, decked in jewels, the scent of incense thick enough to make courtiers faint. But perhaps the most poignant vanity projects are the ones that failed. The tombs destroyed, the palaces burned, the monuments toppled. Emperor Nero's grand palace, the Domus Aurea, was buried under new construction as if Rome itself wanted to erase his memory. Cromwell's body was dug up, hanged, and beheaded, so much for lasting glory. Napoleon's first grave was an unmarked one on St. Helena, surrounded only by weeping willows. His grand tomb in Paris came later, when memory had softened, and his enemies had long gone. What these projects reveal is less about architecture and more about fear. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of insignificance. Monarchs who had everything in life still couldn't control how they'd be remembered in death. So they tried to cheat time with stone, marble, and gold. And yet, In the quiet of night, most of these monuments stand empty. The bones have crumbled, the jewels long removed, the kings and queens nothing more than dust. What remains are the walls, the echoes, the ornate ceilings pointing toward heaven. The vanity projects succeeded in surviving, but not in preserving their owner's power. It's oddly soothing, in a way. No matter how grand, no matter how loud, time wins. Even the loudest kings fall silent. Let's drift on now, away from cold tombs and echoing palaces, towards something more chaotic. Because if monarchs were vain in death, they were often spectacularly ridiculous in life, especially when it came to their coronations. Few ceremonies produced quite as much embarrassment as the moment a monarch was supposed to look most majestic. Coronations were supposed to be grand. Sacred rituals. A king or queen anointed before God and people, lifted into the golden seat of authority. But of course, when humans get involved, things rarely go according to plan. Take poor Charles III of Spain, not to be confused with the current Charles III of Britain, though perhaps both share an equal sense of awkward pageantry. In the 18th century, his coronation robes were so heavily embroidered and padded with gold thread that he nearly collapsed under their weight. The symbolism of royal majesty turned into a slow, stumbling march that made him look less like a ruler and more like a man trapped inside an overstuffed sofa. And then there's Napoleon. Oh yes. The man who decided that the Pope should attend his coronation in Paris, but not actually perform the crowning. Napoleon famously seized the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. A statement of independence, certainly. But also a moment that made the entire event feel like a petty playground squabble. The Pope sat sulking, the cardinals looked scandalized, and Napoleon stood there, beaming, as if he'd just won a raffle rather than an empire. But perhaps no coronation was as spectacularly absurd as that of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. In 1896, his coronation included a mass celebration in Moscow's Kudinka Field. Free beer, sausages, and trinkets were promised to the crowd. A rumor spread that there wouldn't be enough to go around. Panic followed. The crowd surged. In the chaos, over 1,000 people were crushed to death. While their bodies were still being cleared, Nicholas and Alexandra dutifully attended a ball that same evening, trying to appear festive. History has never let him forget it. The last Tsar began his reign standing on the ashes of a public relations disaster. Let's drift back further. Medieval coronations were messy affairs. In England, William the Conqueror's crowning in 1066 was accompanied by such loud shouting of acclamations inside Westminster Abbey that Norman guards outside thought a riot was underway. In their panic, they set fire to nearby houses. So while William was being anointed, London burned. The first day of his rule was greeted with flames and chaos, an omen, perhaps, of his violent reign. Then we have Charles VII of France, crowned in Reims during the 100 Years' War. His coronation was meant to be a moment of triumph, thanks largely to Joan of Arc's victories. Unfortunately, the crown itself was misplaced. Some accounts suggest it had been stolen, others say it was simply forgotten in the rush. The king had to make do with a lesser ceremonial crown, a borrowed piece of jewelry that sat slightly askew on his head. Symbolic legitimacy doesn't shine quite so brightly when the crown looks like it was borrowed from a neighbor's attic. In Poland, King Stanislaw Leszczyński's coronation in the 18th century had its own slapstick flavor. The holy oil meant for his anointing ran out halfway through, forcing attendants to scrape the last drops from the bottom of the container. The ceremony limped along with awkward pauses, the king's forehead barely damp. For a ruler meant to be chosen by divine will, the heavens seemed unusually stingy that day. Even Elizabeth II's coronation, though grand, filmed, and endlessly rehearsed, wasn't without trouble. Her coronation robes, heavy and trailing, nearly caused her to trip on the abbey steps. The crown itself, St. Edward's crown, weighed nearly 5 pounds of solid gold. She later admitted she couldn't look down to read her speech without risk of breaking her neck. Majesty, it seems, comes with spinal strain. And then, there's the smaller embarrassments, the slips, the fainting bishops, the horses that bolted at the wrong moment. In one medieval coronation in Germany, the canopy carried above the king tore loose and collapsed mid-ceremony, dropping velvet and dust directly onto his crown. Nothing says divine blessing like being smothered by your own decorations. The truth is, coronations are long, complicated affairs. They involve nervous clerics, heavy crowns, overwrought robes, confused courtiers, and large, restless crowds. The chances of everything going perfectly were slim at best. The fact that we remember these embarrassing moments centuries later suggests they mattered less as sacred rituals, and more as theater gone slightly wrong. And so, kings and queens who wanted to look like gods often ended up looking like exhausted mortals instead, sweaty, awkward, and occasionally buried under collapsing velvet. Let's drift onward now, away from golden crowns and crushed sausages, into another peculiar royal tradition. Because if coronations showed us monarchs at their most awkward, royal weddings often showed them at their most desperate. And desperate royals made for some of the strangest wedding ceremonies in history. Weddings are supposed to be joyous, aren't they? A celebration of love, unity, and all that sentimental fluff. But when you're dealing with royals, weddings stop being about love almost entirely. Instead, they become political transactions, filled with uncomfortable participants, bizarre rituals, and more than a few disasters. Take Margaret of Austria. Poor Margaret was married 3 times. Her first husband died when she was still a child bride. Her second marriage ended in widowhood again, just as she was finally settling in. But it's her third that earns the oddest story. When she married Philibert II of Savoy, the festivities included a strange bridal bed ceremony. In front of courtiers and clerics, Margaret was led to the nuptial chamber, tucked into bed, and blessed like a sacred object. Privacy, you see, was not high on the list of royal luxuries. And then there was poor Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad. Her wedding to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy was passionate, certainly, but also deeply unbalanced. Their union was plagued by jealousy and obsessive behavior. Joanna famously refused to let go of her husband's corpse after his death, dragging it with her from town to town. Romantic? Hardly. More like the world's most morbid honeymoon. In Scotland, James II's wedding in 1449 to Mary of Guelders was marked by something a bit less tragic and a bit more ridiculous: fireworks. Yes, medieval fireworks. The problem was that they misfired, nearly setting parts of the palace alight. The king's subjects interpreted the accident as a bad omen. But Mary, to her credit, carried on with regal composure, stepping over smoldering debris as if it were nothing more than flower petals. Royal weddings also sometimes included people who weren't actually present. Proxy marriages were a favorite among dynasties trying to arrange unions across borders. A nobleman would stand in for the absent groom, or bride, sometimes going through the full motions of the ceremony. Imagine saying "I do" while holding hands with someone's ambassador, then later meeting your actual spouse weeks or months afterward. Awkward doesn't quite cover it. Catherine of Aragon endured such a proxy wedding before she ever laid eyes on Prince Arthur of England. When she finally did meet him, the excitement quickly turned to tragedy. Arthur died months later, leaving Catherine in limbo before her eventual, infamous marriage to Henry VIII. Speaking of Henry VIII, his weddings deserve their own category. 6 of them, to be precise. He married Anne of Cleves in 1540 after commissioning flattering portraits of her from Hans Holbein. When she finally arrived in England, Henry was disappointed. He complained she looked nothing like her picture and called her a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled within months. Essentially, it was the 16th century equivalent of being catfished. Royal weddings weren't always disastrous for the couple, though. Sometimes the disasters fell squarely on the guests. Take the French royal wedding of 1572, between Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre. The marriage was supposed to heal the religious rift between Catholics and Protestants. Instead, it triggered the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Thousands were killed in the streets of Paris, all during what was meant to be a unifying celebration. Perhaps the worst wedding reception in history. On a lighter, if still bizarre note, Louis XIV of France's wedding included a feast so enormous that guests reportedly fainted from overeating. Tables buckled under mountains of roasted meats, sugared fruits, and ornate pastries. One ambassador wrote that he couldn't remember a single dish clearly because there were simply too many of them. It was decadence to the point of absurdity, exactly what Louis intended, of course. And we can't forget Charles VI of France, also called Charles the Mad. His daughter Isabella was married off to Richard II of England when she was only 6 years old. The ceremony was solemn, the child dressed in royal finery, and Richard, nearly 30, stood beside her with the expression of a man fulfilling a treaty rather than a marriage. Their union was never consummated, but it illustrates just how little romance had to do with royal weddings. Children, treaties, and awkward spectacles were the norm. These weddings were less about joining hearts than about stitching dynasties together. If love bloomed, it was an accident. If disaster followed, it was expected. And so, the grandest of celebrations often turned into the most awkward spectacles. Guests dodged fireworks, kings recoiled at their brides, and brides sometimes never even met their husbands until after the ceremony. It's no wonder so many royal marriages ended in either absurdity or tragedy. But if weddings were awkward, let's not forget what came after. Because a royal marriage was never complete until it produced heirs. And heirs, especially in royal households, often came into the world in ways that were just as strange as the weddings that created them.